The deputy arrived at my dock at 7 in the morning with the expression of a man who would rather be literally anywhere else on earth. He stood there in the morning mist with his hat in his hands, apologizing with his eyes while delivering the message. Complaint filed. Trespassing on community waters. Ma'am says you need to vacate the shoreline. I had to at least come out, and there she was, standing on her deck across the cove in an outfit you'd wear to a business luncheon, watching the deputy do her work for her with that particular smile. The smile of someone who has just used an institution to make a point about who is in charge. I packed up my gear without argument. The click of my tackle box closing echoed across water that had been in my family for 34 years. I watched the deputy drive away. I watched the woman go back inside, satisfied. Then I sat in my truck for 2 minutes, thinking about a piece of paper in my safe deposit box. Not the deed to my lakefront lot, a different document, an older one that describes not the land next to the water, but the water itself. I drove home, called a property attorney, and started the process that would end with this woman standing in front of county commissioners trying to explain why she had been charging her neighbors to use my lake. Tell me where you're watching from, because what I'm about to describe is not a story about winning an argument. It is a story about what happens when someone builds an empire on land they never bothered to check they actually owned. My name is Roberta Ashby. I'm 61 years old, retired from a career in construction project management, and I have lived on Clearwater Lake for 34 years. I came here the same way most people come to a place like this. Grief brought me, and the water kept me. My husband Paul died young. Heart attack at 52, no warning, no goodbye. We had been planning to retire on this property together. The cabin was going to be our second chapter. After he was gone, the second chapter became the only chapter. And I stayed because leaving would have meant acknowledging that the version of the future we had planned was permanently closed. The lake became my anchor. Every morning for 34 years, regardless of weather or season or mood, I have spent time on that water, fishing in summer, watching the ice form in winter, kayaking in the shoulder seasons when the lake is quiet and the light does something particular to the surface that I have never successfully described to anyone who has not seen it. It is not a hobby, it is a practice. It is the thing that has kept me structurally sound through the years when I was not sure I would remain so. The property came from Paul's family. His father had purchased it in the early 1960s as part of a larger land transaction with a timber company that had been operating in the region since the 1940s. The timber company had acquired comprehensive resource rights to the area during a period when resource extraction laws allowed for the kind of sweeping property purchases that would look unusual today. When the timber operations concluded and the company dissolved, the asset package was divided among the purchasing partners. Paul's father acquired not just the lakeside acreage but something the timber company had included in the parcel as a matter of course. Water rights to Clearwater Lake, surface rights, lake bed ownership, the complete package that the timber company had originally needed to operate their log transport and water-based processing. It was in the deed. It had always been in the deed. I had read the deed. I had simply never needed to use what it said until the summer that Claudia Renner moved in across the cove and decided the lake needed management. Claudia arrived 18 months ago in a vehicle that announced ambition before she opened the door. She was 52, recently relocated from a major metropolitan area, former director of regional compliance for a financial services company. She was the kind of person who brings organizational frameworks to situations that have been functioning without them for decades and mistakes the absence of structure for the presence of a problem. She had purchased the largest property on the lake, a modern construction that stood in contrast to the older cabins that had been the character of Clearwater Lake for 2 generations. She introduced herself to neighbors with the careful warmth of someone running a campaign. She attended the informal gathering that occurs every summer when people who share a shoreline eat together and remember they are a community. Within 3 months, she was proposing a homeowners association. The pitch was competent. Safety protocols for water recreation, coordinated dock maintenance, a shared fund for lake health monitoring, liability protection for everyone. She had a printed proposal with a budget and bylaws already drafted. She presented it at a meeting in her living room that felt less like a neighborhood conversation and more like a board presentation. 8 of the 22 households signed on. Mostly newer residents who recognized the language Claudia was using from their professional lives and found it reassuring. The older residents, the ones who had been on this lake for decades, were more skeptical. We had been managing without an HOA since the first cabin went up. The lake was clean, nobody had drowned, the docks were maintained. The system that existed was the system of people who lived next to each other and handled problems as they arose, because that is what neighbors do. I declined politely. Several others declined as well. Claudia sent a second letter. Then, a third, each one slightly more formal in tone, slightly more specific about consequences for non-participating households. By the fourth letter, the word obligation had appeared. I called her. I explained that my family had been on this lake for 34 years and that I had no interest in paying monthly fees to an organization I had not agreed to join and that had no legal authority over my property. She told me that lake-adjacent residents had shared obligations regardless of individual preferences. I told her I disagreed. She told me we would revisit this. I filed the exchange in the mental category of situations to monitor. The monitoring accelerated when the signs went up. Claudia posted laminated notices at the boat launch, the 2 public access paths to the shoreline, and at the dock shared by 3 households on the north end. Private Clearwater Lake HOA. Members-only access. All others subject to trespass citation. I stood at the boat launch reading one of these signs for a while, and then I drove to the county courthouse and asked to see the property records for the lake itself. The county assessor's office is staffed by a woman named Florence, who has been working there for 27 years, and whose institutional knowledge of local property history is genuinely encyclopedic. She pulled up the relevant records, cross-referenced the original timber company purchase, and then spent about 10 minutes tracing the chain of ownership through the dissolution of the timber operation to the partners who had acquired the various pieces. She said, "You've been paying property taxes on the lake since 1994. I said I knew that. She said, "Does the woman putting up those signs know that?" I said probably not. Florence showed me where the water rights were recorded, how the lakebed ownership had transferred, and what the specific language in the original conveyance meant in terms of current property rights. The conversation took 45 minutes and was one of the most educational property law tutorials I have ever received. When I left, I called Paul's daughter from his first marriage, who is a real estate attorney in a city 3 hours away, and described what Florence had shown me. She called me back 2 hours later after reviewing the documents I had photographed and said, "Aunt Roberta, you own the lake. I want to be precise about what this means legally, because it matters for the story. Owning the lake bed and water rights does not mean I own everyone's dock or the land they built their houses on. What it means is that the water itself, the right to use the water, the access to the water, the activities conducted on the water, these are governed by the water rights holder, which was me. Every household on Clearwater Lake was using the water under an informal arrangement that had functioned without documentation for decades, because nobody had ever challenged it. The arrangement worked because it was based on mutual respect rather than legal hierarchy. Nobody needed to know who owned what because nobody was trying to use ownership as a weapon. Claudia had changed that by claiming that the HOA managed the lake as a community asset and charging membership fees for what she characterized as water access privileges. She was selling access to something she did not own. The money was not going toward the lake. It was going toward the HOA's administrative operations, which Claudia controlled, and which a records request I filed 6 weeks later would reveal had been allocated with a creative flexibility that would eventually interest the county's financial oversight office. I did not move immediately. I have spent 34 years managing construction projects, which is an education in how timing determines outcomes. The right intervention at the wrong moment is worse than waiting. I documented everything. I kept every letter, every notice, every interaction. I photographed the unauthorized signs. I built a file. I also had conversations with the neighbors who had been most affected. An elderly couple on the east side who had been using the South Dock access path for 18 years for the husband's daily walk. Doctor's orders for his circulation, who had been told by Claudia that non-member access was suspended. A family on the north end who had been issued a citation for their children swimming off their own dock, characterized as unauthorized recreational use of whole waters. A man who had lived on this lake for 29 years who had received a letter explaining that his kayak constituted commercial equipment because he occasionally guided a friend. The pattern was what I had learned to recognize in 25 years of managing construction sites with difficult stakeholders. It was not about safety or property values or community standards. It was about establishing control and extracting compliance through the manufactured appearance of authority. I called Paul's daughter again and told her I was ready to move. The morning the deputy arrived at my dock was 3 months into this process. Claudia had been escalating progressively, and the trespass complaint was her most significant escalation yet, an official filing with the sheriff's department, complete with photographs of me standing at the shoreline with my fishing gear. I was standing at the shoreline of my own lake, with my fishing gear, in the early morning light. Exactly as I had done 5,000 times before, the deputy was apologetic and thorough. He documented the complaint. He asked me questions. He had the demeanor of someone who had investigated enough neighbor disputes to recognize when the official story and the real story were not the same thing. He told me to stay off the HOA's designated waters pending resolution of the property dispute, and looked uncomfortable saying it. I told him I understood. I told him I would be in touch. The next call I made was to the county assessor's office to request a certified copy of the lakebed ownership records. The call after that was to a property surveyor to mark the exact boundaries of my water rights. The call after that was to the county commissioner's office to request time on the agenda of the next public meeting. Claudia's enforcement action had given me the occasion I needed to have the conversation publicly, with official witnesses, and with the formal documentation of record. She prepared for the county meeting the way she had prepared for her HOA formation pitch, comprehensively and with genuine professional skill. She brought a presentation. She brought supporting documentation. She brought 3 other HOA presidents from neighboring communities who could speak to the general principle of shared resource management in lake communities. She brought a photographer. She had also, and this detail matters, filed a request with the sheriff's office for enforcement support at the meeting in the event that I became disruptive. She genuinely expected to walk out of that meeting with official county recognition of the HOA's management authority over Clearwater Lake. I arrived with my attorney, with Florence from the assessor's office, who had agreed to attend as a factual resource, and with a manila envelope containing the property deed, the certified records of lakebed ownership, and 34 years of property tax statements showing my annual payment on the water rights. Claudia presented for 20 minutes. The presentation was good. She covered community safety, liability management, environmental protection, coordinated recreational scheduling. She described the lake as a shared community asset requiring professional stewardship. She formally requested that the county recognize the HOA's management authority and provide enforcement support for non-member access restrictions. She was specific and confident and entirely wrong about one foundational fact. When Commissioner Harding opened the floor for responses, I walked to the podium. I thanked Claudia for her evident commitment to the community's welfare. I said I shared her interest in Clearwater Lake's long-term health. I said I had some clarifying information about the ownership structure of the lake that I thought might be relevant to the commissioner's deliberations. Then I placed the certified copy of the water rights deed on the table in front of them and told them what it said. The room went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when something that seemed like a complicated argument suddenly becomes a simple question of fact. Commissioner Harding looked at the deed, looked at Claudia, looked at me, said, "Mrs. Ashby, are you saying you own the lake?" I said I was saying the deed said I owned the lake, and I would defer to the county's legal assessment, but yes, that appeared to be what the documentation established. Florence stood up from her seat in the gallery and confirmed that the county assessor's records were consistent with what I had presented, that the water rights had been recorded and taxed under my name since 1994, and that there was no county record of any transfer of those rights to any homeowners association or any other entity. Claudia stood up and said there must be an error. Her attorney, who had been brought in specifically to support her presentation, leaned over and said something in her ear. Claudia sat back down. The attorney stood up and requested a 30-day continuance to review the property documentation. Commissioner Harding denied the continuance. The records were present and certified. The commissioners could take the matter under advisement without a delay. They took approximately 22 minutes. The determination was straightforward. The Clearwater Lake HOA had no documented authority over water rights that were held by a private individual. Any fees collected for lake access had been collected without legal basis. Any restrictions imposed on non-members' access to water rights held by a private property owner were unenforceable and potentially constituted interference with property rights. The HOA's signage was to be removed from all access points within 72 hours. The commissioner's closing comment was addressed generally to the room rather than to anyone specifically. He said that the situation illustrated the importance of verifying the legal basis for any organization claiming authority over community resources before joining, paying fees, or accepting restrictions. He said it mildly, the way officials say things they want on the record without making it a speech. Claudia's photographer had packed up his equipment before the ruling was complete. I want to tell you what happened after, because the after matters as much as the confrontation. The HOA dissolved within 6 weeks. Without a legal foundation for its core claim, the fee collection stopped, the enforcement mechanisms stopped, and the members who had joined in good faith found themselves relieved of an obligation they had never fully understood the basis for. The financial records that came out of the dissolution process revealed that the HOA's funds had been managed with a flexibility that the county's Financial Oversight Office found worth reviewing. The review is ongoing. I am not going to characterize its likely outcome, because that is not my determination to make. Claudia listed her property 4 months after the county meeting. It sold after 60 days at a price that real estate agents on the lake described as reflecting the market accurately. She moved. I do not know where she went, and I do not spend time thinking about it. The neighbors who had been most affected, the elderly couple whose access path had been blocked, the family whose children had been sighted, the man whose kayak had been characterized as commercial equipment, received formal written acknowledgement from the county that the restrictions they had been subjected to had no legal basis and that their property rights had been unaffected throughout. The dock path was restored. The signs came down. The boat launch returned to what it had been for decades, a quiet ramp where people backed their trailers into the water in the early morning without asking permission from anyone. I did 2 things after it was resolved that I want to describe, because they came from different parts of the experience. The first was practical. I worked with Paul's daughter and a local attorney to draft a formal lake access agreement that codified what had always been the informal arrangement. Every household on Clearwater Lake received a copy. The document established clear access rights for all adjacent landowners, outlined the basic expectations for responsible use that had always existed through common understanding, and created a simple annual lake stewardship contribution that went into a monitored fund for water quality testing and access path maintenance. Not an HOA, an agreement between neighbors about something they share. Every household signed it, including the households that had been Claudia's HOA members. The second thing was personal. I went back to my dock the morning after the county meeting at the same hour I had been going there for 34 years. The light was doing what it does when summer is ending and the angle changes something particular, something that has no good English word for it. The loons were out. I sat there for a long time without fishing, just watching the water. I thought about Paul, the way I still do at the water every morning. I thought about his father and the deed in the safe deposit box, and whatever instinct or circumstance had led him to purchase water rights in the 1960s, as part of a transaction nobody expected to matter 60 years later. I thought about what it means to own something you cannot see the edges of a lake, a community, a life built in one place over decades. Owning the lake never changed anything about how I used it or how I thought about it. The lake was always ours in the way that places are yours when you have loved them long enough. The deed was just paper. The water was the real thing. What changed was that someone had come in and tried to put a price on what we had always shared freely, and the paper turned out to matter after all. Here is what I want you to take from this, because it is transferable. If you live near water, a lake, a river, a pond, read your deed all the way to the end. Not just the property description. All of it. Water rights, mineral rights, easements, the sections with the older language that most people skip because they assume it does not apply. What was purchased in the 1940s and 1950s and 1960s was often purchased comprehensively in ways that current owners do not know about because nobody told them to look. If an HOA claims authority over a shared resource, ask to see the documentation establishing that authority, not the bylaws the HOA drafted for itself, the county records establishing the legal basis for the claim. HOAs can only govern what they legally control. If they cannot show you the recorded documentation, the authority they are claiming may not exist. And if someone is charging you money for access to something you have been using freely for years, ask them who owns it before you pay. Sometimes the answer is you. Subscribe if this was worth your time. Drop your story in the comments. The property law situations I find most interesting are the ones where the key document was sitting in a filing cabinet or a safe deposit box the whole time, and the conflict only escalated because nobody looked. The water is still there. The mornings are still quiet. I am still fishing.